In December 1941, German soldier Hans Weber wrote his final letter home. "Mother, my feet have turned black. The man next to me froze to death last night, but we can't bury him. The ground is too hard, and we're too weak. I'm starting to understand. The cold isn't just killing us, it's erasing us." 3 days later, his unit disappeared entirely. No bodies were ever found. This was just one of thousands of similar stories from the Eastern Front of World War II, where soldiers didn't just die, they vanished into a frozen nightmare that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The Eastern Front's winter wasn't just cold, it was an active predator. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze the oil in tank engines and turn rifle bolts into useless blocks of ice. But the real horror lay in what it did to human bodies. German troops, trained for blitzkrieg warfare, found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't shoot: hypothermia. Their summer uniforms, still reeking of France's warm fields, became death traps. Soldiers would wake up to find their eyelids frozen shut. Those who managed to pry them open often discovered their comrades frozen solid in their sleep, faces locked in eternal expressions of confusion. The Wehrmacht's supply system, designed for rapid advancement, collapsed under winter's assault. Tanks and vehicles froze in place, creating metallic graveyards that stretched for miles. Soldiers would cannibalize these mechanical corpses, burning precious fuel in desperate attempts to stay warm, knowing they were sacrificing their means of escape. The frostbite epidemic reached apocalyptic proportions. Medics reported entire platoons where not a single man had all his toes. Soldiers developed a terrifying new ritual. Every morning, they would knock their boots against trees. The hollow clunk meant their feet were still attached. A metallic ring meant their flesh had frozen solid. Medical officers documented a phenomenon they called winter madness. Soldiers would strip naked and run into snowstorms, convinced they were burning up. Others would bury themselves in snow, claiming they could hear it whispering secrets about surviving the cold. The human mind, it seemed, broke down in patterns as predictable as frostbite. The cold bred innovation born of desperation. Soldiers wrapped themselves in newspapers, stuffed their uniforms with straw, and even gutted dead horses to crawl inside for warmth. Some units developed a rotation system. 3 men would share 2 pairs of boots, with one man always barefoot inside a tent, trying to restore circulation to blackened feet. The Soviet army, better prepared but not immune, faced its own winter demons. Their quilted uniforms provided better protection, but created new dangers. Wounded men would often freeze into the quilting, requiring medics to cut away chunks of flesh along with the fabric. Some soldiers would urinate on their rifle bolts to keep them functioning, leading to a horrific choice when nature called: relieve themselves and risk their weapons freezing, or hold it and risk kidney failure. The cold transformed the battlefield itself. Artillery shells would create instant ice crystals in the air, forming strange halos that veterans called death auroras. The frozen ground became so hard that traditional foxholes were impossible to dig. Soldiers resorted to piling up frozen corpses as makeshift fortifications, leading to the grotesque sight of defensive lines that seemed to writhe and shift as the bodies settled. What veterans remember most wasn't the gunfire or explosions, it was the sound. Winter warfare had its own terrible symphony, the screech of tank tracks breaking on frozen ground, a hollow boom of trees exploding as their sap froze, the wet crack of frozen flesh shattering like glass. But worst of all was the silence that followed a battlefield death. No screams, no moans, just the soft whisper of snow covering another body. The cold created unprecedented medical horrors. Field hospitals reported cases of gangrene that spread faster than any doctor had ever seen, the frozen flesh turning black within hours. Morphine froze in its vials. Blood plasma became useless chunks of ice. Medics discovered that wounded men left in the cold wouldn't bleed out. Instead, their blood would freeze in their veins, creating a new form of death that veterans called crystallization. The logistics of managing the dead became impossible. Bodies couldn't be buried in the frozen ground. They couldn't be burned because frozen flesh wouldn't ignite. Instead, corpses were stacked like cordwood behind the lines, creating massive walls of frozen dead that would stand until spring. Some veterans reported that these macabre fortifications would occasionally shift or groan as the bodies settled, creating the illusion that the dead were still moving. Even the simplest tasks became potentially lethal. Methyl water canteens would freeze to soldiers' lips, ripping off skin when pulled away. Men would wake up to find their hair frozen to their helmets. The act of breathing itself became dangerous. Inhaling too sharply could freeze the moisture in your lungs. Soldiers learned to breathe through scars, creating ice-encrusted masks that had to be regularly broken away from their faces. Perhaps most terrifying was how the cold changed the way men died. A shot soldier wouldn't bleed out. Their blood would freeze before it hit the ground, creating red crystals that crunched underfoot. Bodies didn't decay but mummified, preserving expressions of terror that would emerge months later during the spring thaw. Some veterans swore that on particularly cold nights, you could hear the dead crackling as they froze, a sound they described as winter's laughter. The psychological impact of continuous exposure to these conditions created what doctors later termed frost shock syndrome. Survivors would spend the rest of their lives unable to touch ice cubes or enter walk-in freezers. Many moved to tropical climates, abandoning successful careers and families in their desperate need to escape winter's ghost. But as horrific as the physical torment of the cold was, something even more sinister was destroying these men from the inside out. The human mind, it turned out, could break in ways that no medical manual had ever documented. The physical toll of the Eastern Front was matched only by its psychological devastation. Soviet artillery batteries would fire single shells at random intervals throughout the night, not to kill, but to prevent sleep. After 3 days without rest, soldiers reported seeing phantom armies marching through snowstorms. After 5 days, some couldn't distinguish between reality and hallucination. Russian commanders had mastered the art of psychological torment. They would position loudspeakers in no man's land, playing recordings of German children crying for their fathers. Other times, they broadcast the sounds of warm fires crackling and food sizzling. Knowing the frozen, starving men in the trenches would be driven mad by these reminders of home. The constant bombardment created a phenomenon doctors called artillery ears. Soldiers' hearing would become so sensitive that the slightest sound could trigger panic attacks. Men would freeze at the crunch of snow under their own boots, convinced each step was the whistle of an incoming shell. The psychological torture wasn't limited to enemy action. Nature itself seemed to conspire against sanity. The endless white landscape created severe sensory deprivation. Soldiers reported losing all sense of depth perception, walking into walls of snow they thought were meters away. The constant whiteness would burn itself into their retinas, causing hallucinations of colorful patterns that veterans called snow rainbows. These visual distortions became more elaborate as exhaustion set in. Men reported seeing cities floating in the sky, complete with streetcars and pedestrians going about their daily lives. Others became convinced that the snow itself was alive, forming shapes and figures that would dance at the edge of their vision, always disappearing when looked at directly. Battle fatigue took on new forms in the east. Soldiers would be found wandering in no man's land, collecting frozen fingers they believed were cigarettes. Others would suddenly start digging with their bare hands, trying to tunnel their way home. Medical officers documented cases of men who simply stopped speaking, their minds retreating into silence as deep as the Russian winter. The isolation drove men to strange behaviors. Some units developed elaborate rituals, convinced that certain patterns of behavior would protect them from death. They would only eat facing east or insist on walking backwards during patrol. Others became obsessed with numbers, counting bullets, steps, or breaths, believing that keeping the right count would ensure survival. Time itself seemed to break down. Without regular daylight, men lost all sense of chronology. Some would insist that they had been in position for years, while others would swear they had just arrived, despite months of combat. Officers reported finding men who had developed their own calendars, marking time by events that had never happened. communication breakdowns became common as units lost touch with reality. One German company spent 3 days firing at what they thought were Russian infiltrators, only to discover they had been shooting at shadows cast by their own dead. Another unit reported an enemy attack that never happened, complete with detailed descriptions of casualties and combat that existed only in their collective delusion. The darkness of winter brought its own particular madness. During the shortest days, soldiers might see only 3 to 4 hours of dim light. Men would become convinced that the sun had died, that they were living through the end of the world. Some would stand motionless for hours, staring at the horizon, waiting for a dawn they believed would never come. Military doctors began documenting unprecedented forms of group psychosis. Entire units would share the same hallucinations, reporting identical visions of impossible events. One company anonymously insisted they had seen a medieval army marching across the snow, complete with horses and banners. Another claimed they had witnessed a ghostly train running across the sky, carrying dead soldiers back to Germany. Medical officers created new categories of mental breakdown. Some men developed snow blindness psychosis, becoming convinced that they could see through the snow to underground cities where warm, well-fed civilians lived in comfort. Others suffered from winter paranoia, believing that their own breath had become visible as part of an enemy plot to reveal their positions. The worst cases ended in what military psychiatrists termed Eastern Front syndrome. Soldiers would develop an unshakable belief that they had already died and were trapped in a frozen hell. These men would stop eating, stop sleeping, and eventually stop moving altogether, becoming living statues in the snow. Even the veterans who maintained their sanity developed peculiar coping mechanisms. Some would hold conversations with corpses, updating dead comrades on the day's events. Others created elaborate fantasy worlds, writing detailed letters home about imaginary leave periods that never happened. These letters often described warm beaches and sunny days, as if writing about heat could somehow make it real. The sound of combat itself became a source of psychological trauma. Unlike the Western Front, where artillery barrages created a constant background noise, the Eastern Front was characterized by sudden, shocking bursts of violence, followed by endless silence. This irregular pattern prevented soldiers from developing the psychological defenses that came with routine. Each quiet period became a form of torture, as men waited for the next explosion, the next scream, the next death. In the depths of their psychological breakdown, some men discovered they were capable of actions that would haunt them long after the war. As food supplies dwindled and temperatures dropped, the line between survival and savagery began to blur, pushing soldiers toward choices that would redefine their understanding of human nature. As supplies dwindled, survival meant crossing moral lines that could never be uncrossed. In the siege of Stalingrad, both German and Soviet troops resorted to cannibalism. But it wasn't just about eating the dead, it was about choosing who would die next. Units developed unspoken systems for selecting the weakest, waiting for them to die naturally while secretly hoping it would happen soon. The shortage of antifreeze led to a grotesque calculation. Soldiers discovered that drinking small amounts would lower their body's freezing point, but too much would kill them. Men would measure careful sips of the toxic liquid, gambling their lives against the cold. Some survived. Many didn't. Those who lived would later report that the sweet taste of antifreeze haunted them more than the memory of combat. Food became a form of currency more valuable than ammunition. Men would trade their weapons for a single can of beans, leaving themselves defenseless but fed. Some soldiers began eating their leather belts and boots, knowing they were sacrificing long-term survival for one more day of life. Medical reports documented men with stomachs full of newspaper, tree bark, and boiled cotton from their own uniforms. The desperate search for calories led to horrifying innovations. Soldiers learned to extract fat from dead bodies, using it both for food and to waterproof their boots. They would boil tree roots for days, creating a tasteless gruel that offered almost no nutrition, but helped them feel full. Some units discovered they could survive by drinking melted candle wax, though it caused severe digestive problems. The hunger changed how men viewed everything around them. Soldiers began categorizing every object by its potential edibility. Leather straps became future meals. Wood could be ground into sawdust and mixed with any available liquid to create a paste that would at least fill their stomachs. Boot polish, marketed as containing animal fats, would be scraped out and eaten, often leading to severe poisoning. The cold amplified the desperation. Men discovered that extreme hunger actually made them more susceptible to freezing. This created a vicious cycle. The more they needed calories to fight the cold, the less their bodies could process what little food they found. Medical officers documented cases of soldiers dying with full stomachs, their bodies unable to digest the inedible materials they'd consumed. Last stand scenarios took on a different meaning in the East. Cut-off units wouldn't just fight to the death, they would fight against death itself. In one documented case, a surrounded German platoon survived for 2 weeks by sleeping in shifts inside a pile of their dead comrades, using the frozen bodies as insulation against the cold. The breakdown of military discipline created new hierarchies based solely on survival. Officers found their authority meaningless against the basic needs of their men. Some units developed complex sharing systems, pooling their meager resources and distributing them based on who had the best chance of survival. Others descended into savage competition, with stronger soldiers beating or killing weaker ones for their rations. Medical supplies became objects of desperate desire. Morphine addictions skyrocketed as men discovered they could suppress both pain and hunger with the drug. When morphine ran out, soldiers turned to any chemicals they could find: antifreeze, fuel alcohol, even ammunition cleaning solvent. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones survived with permanent organ damage. Field hospitals became scenes of unimaginable horror. Doctors reported treating men who had chewed off their own frostbitten fingers, claiming they couldn't resist the urge to eat something they already felt dead. Others arrived with perforated stomachs from eating metal objects, driven by the body's desperate demand for iron. Some had resorted to drinking their own blood, creating a self-destructive cycle that weakened them further. In their desperation for warmth, men resorted to extreme measures. They would intentionally wound themselves to get sent to field hospitals, knowing that even a few hours in a heated room might help them survive another week. Some would inject themselves with contaminated water, causing infections that would raise their body temperature. The fever might kill them, but they viewed it as preferable to freezing. The psychological impact of these survival tactics created what doctors later called survivor's guilt complex. Men who lived through the winter, by participating in these desperate acts, would spend the rest of their lives torn between the instinct that kept them alive and the moral horror of what they had done. Many survivors would refuse to eat meat for the rest of their lives, haunted by memories of what meat had meant on the Eastern Front. Reports from field hospitals revealed the physical toll of these desperate survival methods. Men arrived with stomachs full of sawdust, leather, and paper. Their bodies, struggling to process these inedible materials, would begin to shut down. Doctors documented cases of soldiers who had survived the winter only to die in spring, their bodies finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of their survival tactics. While frontline soldiers grappled with these impossible choices, civilians trapped in the war zone faced their own desperate battle for survival. Behind the lines, a different kind of warfare was unfolding, one that would turn neighbor against neighbor and reshape the very fabric of society. The partisan warfare on the Eastern Front created a shadow war more terrifying than the official one. Civilians caught between armies faced impossible choices. Villages would be burned by one side for helping the enemy, then burned again by the other side for the same reason. Children were recruited as spies, their small frames able to slip through defensive lines. Many never returned. Supply lines became highways of horror. Truck drivers would discover their cargo of food had been replaced with dead bodies during the night. A psychological warfare tactic that proved devastatingly effective. Some routes became so notorious that soldiers would choose court-martial over convoy duty. The civilian struggle reached depths that military histories often gloss over. Mothers would suffocate their crying babies to prevent German patrols from finding their hiding places. Old men would volunteer for suicide missions to spare younger men with families. The line between survival and monstrosity blurred until it disappeared entirely. Partisan fighters developed methods that blended ancient farming knowledge with modern warfare. They would plant crops in specific patterns to send messages visible only from the air. Underground bunkers were disguised as haystacks or barns, complete with deliberate signs of decay to avoid suspicion. Some groups maintained vast networks of tunnels, connecting multiple villages underground. Winter brought its own form of guerrilla warfare. Partisans would deliberately freeze lakes at certain points, creating invisible weak spots in the ice. German vehicles, seemingly crossing on solid ice, would suddenly plunge into the freezing water. Resistance fighters learned to build shelters inside snowdrifts, creating hidden observation posts that could monitor enemy movements for days. The local population learned to live dual lives. By day, they would appear to cooperate with whoever held power. By night, they might be moving weapons, treating wounded fighters, or gathering intelligence. Children grew up learning to lie convincingly about their parents' whereabouts. Entire communities developed complex codes using everyday objects: the position of a bucket, the color of hanging laundry, the arrangement of firewood. Intelligence gathering became an art form. Old women, seemingly gathering mushrooms in the forest, would count tank tracks and artillery positions. Children playing in the streets would memorize patrol patterns. Even the village idiots ignored by occupation forces were often key intelligence assets, their apparent mindless wandering concealing careful observation. Food became a weapon more potent than bullets. Partisans would poison wells and food stores before retreating, knowing the advancing army would have to choose between starvation and risk. Some groups engineered elaborate deceptions, leaving caches of contaminated supplies that looked like they had been hastily abandoned. Village life transformed into a complex theater of deception. Farmers would deliberately plant crops to fail, ensuring just enough food for the village while convincing occupiers that they couldn't provide more. Families developed elaborate systems for hiding food: false walls in root cellars, hollow trees in the forest, even underwater caches and ponds. The psychological toll on civilians was catastrophic. Living under constant suspicion destroyed traditional community bonds. People learned to trust no one, not their neighbors, not their friends, sometimes not even their own family members. Children were taught to keep secrets before they learned to read. The elderly, often left behind when younger people fled, became unwitting pawns in the intelligence war. The occupying forces responded with increasingly brutal pacification efforts. Entire villages would be rounded up and held hostage for the actions of a few partisans. The Germans developed a mathematical formula. For every soldier killed by partisans, they would execute 10 civilians. For every officer, they would kill an entire village. Underground education became a form of resistance. Teachers would hold secret classes in barns and cellars, ensuring children learned their true history rather than the occupiers' version. Books were carefully hidden, shared between villages in elaborate relay systems. Some communities maintained underground printing presses, producing both propaganda and preservation of their culture. Women became crucial players in this shadow war. They could move more freely than men, often passing through checkpoints with less scrutiny. Many became message carriers, weapon smugglers, and intelligence gatherers. Some would cultivate relationships with enemy officers, gathering information that would later lead to devastating ambushes. The forests themselves became actors in this conflict. Partisans developed an intimate knowledge of the woodland, using natural features as weapons. They would lead pursuing forces into swamps or over thin ice. Some groups became so adapted to forest life that they could move silently through areas their pursuers found impassable. Medical care took on medieval characteristics. With hospitals under enemy control, the resistance developed underground medical networks. Kitchen tables became operating theaters. Veterinary supplies were adapted for human use. Women learned to perform emergency surgeries using instructions passed down through whispered conversations and hand-drawn diagrams. The resistance created parallel societies with their own laws, courts, and systems of justice. Traitors would be tried in forest tribunals. Collaboration with the enemy might be punished not by death, but by the execution of family members, a psychological torture that proved more effective than personal threats. When the war finally ended, these shadow warriors discovered that survival had changed them in ways that peaceful society couldn't understand. The very skills that had kept them alive, suspicion, deception, ruthlessness, now marked them as outsiders in the world they had fought to defend. Those who survived the Eastern Front found that survival itself was a kind of prison. Post-war studies showed that 80% of veterans experienced severe PTSD, but most never sought treatment. How do you explain to a doctor that you can't sleep because you still hear the sound of frozen bodies being stacked like firewood? Identity itself became a casualty. Survivors would obsessively hoard food, unable to shake the memory of hunger. Some would sleep on the floor, finding beds too soft after years of frozen ground. Others would wake up screaming, convinced their feet had turned black again. The medical community struggled to categorize the unique trauma of Eastern Front veterans. Traditional therapy methods proved inadequate. How do you help a man who survived by consuming human flesh? What comfort can you offer someone who had to choose which of his friends would die so the others could use his body for warmth? Winter became an annual torture. Veterans would become physically ill at the first snowfall. Some would board up their windows during winter months, unable to look at the snow. Others developed elaborate rituals to cope with cold weather, wearing multiple layers even in mild temperatures, stockpiling food every autumn, or refusing to let their children play in the snow. The trauma manifested in unexpected ways. Some survivors could never eat certain foods again, anything that had been frozen or meat that wasn't thoroughly cooked. Others developed obsessive behaviors around water, keeping every container in their homes filled or carrying canteens even in civilian life. Former partisan fighters faced their own unique challenges. They struggled to turn off the survival instincts that had kept them alive. Many couldn't sleep in the same room as their families, needing to maintain a clear escape route. Some would unconsciously catalog potential weapons whenever they entered a room, or automatically note which floorboards creaked. The children of survivors inherited a different kind of trauma. They grew up in households where food was never wasted, where doors were always locked, where trust was a luxury their parents couldn't afford. Many reported growing up with fathers who would sit in darkened rooms for hours, staring at nothing, or mothers who would secretly test their children's ability to hide at a moment's notice. Relationships proved particularly challenging. How do you build intimacy when you've learned that emotional attachment means eventual loss? Many survivors remained single, while others married but maintained emotional distances that their spouses could never breach. Some would wake up attacking their partners, trapped in nightmares of hand-to-hand combat. The medical consequences lingered for decades. Many survivors developed early-onset arthritis from old frostbite injuries. Others suffered from mysterious digestive problems, their bodies still dealing with the damage from years of consuming anything that might provide calories. Some developed rare cancers, possibly linked to the desperate measures they'd taken to survive. German and Soviet survivors shared an unexpected bond. In veterans' hospitals, former enemies would recognize the same haunted look, the same winter-born terrors. They developed their own language of trauma. Snow eyes for the thousand-yard stare, frost dreams for the nightmares that never stopped. Perhaps most tragic were those who had survived through moral compromise. The men who had eaten their dead comrades, who had left others to die so they might live, who had committed atrocities under the pressure of survival. These survivors often lived seemingly normal lives while carrying internal wounds that never healed. Society struggled to acknowledge their suffering. Military histories focused on strategies and statistics, while personal accounts often proved too horrific for public consumption. Many survivors found that people didn't want to hear their stories, couldn't bear to know what human beings were capable of in extreme conditions. Even decades later, new symptoms would emerge. As survivors aged, their control over suppressed memories weakened. Nursing homes reported elderly veterans becoming hysterical at the sight of snow through windows, or refusing to eat if their food wasn't still steaming hot. Some would collect and hide food in their rooms, even when well-fed and cared for. The trauma extended beyond just the soldiers. Civilians who had survived occupation carried their own deep wounds. Women who had used relationships with enemy officers to gather intelligence often faced ostracism in their communities. Children who had served as partisan messengers grew into adults who could never fully trust authority figures. Their stories began disappearing with them. Many took their darkest memories to the grave, believing that some horrors were better left unspoken. Others tried to share their experiences, but found that younger generations couldn't comprehend the depths of their suffering. The result was a generation of survivors who died feeling profoundly alone, even when surrounded by family. The Eastern Front didn't just claim lives, it devoured souls. Its veterans carried scars that no medal could honor and no history book could capture. Their stories remind us that in war's darkest corners, survival itself can become a curse, and the real battle begins only after the fighting ends. The darkest chapters of World War II are still being uncovered, and what we're about to show you next will change everything you thought you knew about war. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss another video.